It's Friday, it's 12:15 and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights from across the UK. I'll be joined by colleagues in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our political correspondent, Sean Curran. This week, as the row over parties in Number 10 during lockdown continues, the police get involved.
The Met is now investigating a number of events that took place at Downing Street and Whitehall in the last 2 years.
I believe this will help to give the public the clarity it needs and help to draw a line under matters.
Can you survive this, Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister tells MPs he has no intention of stepping down.
The Ministerial Code says that ministers who knowingly mislead Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation. Does the Prime Minister believe that applies to him?
For all sorts of reasons, many people may want me out of the way, but I tell you the reason he wants me out of the way is because he knows that this government can be trusted to deliver.
Thank you and goodbye.
A resignation in the Lords as a Treasury Minister walks out after criticising his own government over fraud in COVID business loans. And the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party is forced to apologise over tweets.
I have to say to wider society, Mr Speaker, that my language was wrong at every level and I have to apologise to all of them.
For a political leader to be engaged in online what he deems to be jokes, I do not deem to be jokes, I think it's just incredulous.
Let's start here in Westminster with Sean Curran. Sean, what a week it's been. We saw there in the headlines, there's only really been one issue dominating life and the agenda here in Westminster. We've been expecting the results of the inquiry from Sue Gray, the senior civil servant who is investigating lockdown parties, but there was an unexpected turn of events. What's happened?
Absolutely. So, we've been waiting, as you say, for a development. Well, we got one this week when Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, announced, after having been asked for weeks and weeks whether there was going to be any sort of police investigation into what happened in Downing Street and Whitehall, that yes, the police were going to investigate. And of course, that wasn't the only development, because also this week, Downing Street admitted that some staff and Boris Johnson had gathered together in June 2020 to celebrate his birthday. Now, the significance of this is this was a time when the rest of the country was in a very tight lockdown, and in most circumstances you couldn't have more than two people together in indoor gatherings. So it seemed to add yet another aspect to this long-running row about what actually was going on during lockdown in Downing Street and Whitehall. So, not surprisingly, once we got the news of this latest development about the police investigation, all sorts of questions about what would happen next, what could happen next, what could MPs talk about. And so Labour's Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, asked an urgent question in the Commons.
If any evidence emerges of behaviour that is potentially a criminal offence, the matter will be referred to the police. So it seems, Mr Speaker, potential criminality has been found in Downing Street. What a truly damning reflection on our nation's very highest office.
The reality of the matter is that the fact that the police are investigating the matter does not draw any conclusions. If she looks at the statement issued by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Cressida Dick, she has said that, stressed the fact that the Met is investigating does not mean that it will necessarily result in fixed penalty notices in every instance and to every person involved.
When Europe stands on the brink of war and there is a cost of living crisis, can we please have a sense of proportion over the Prime Minister being given a piece of cake in his own office by his own staff?
Well, those eagle-eyed will have noticed Boris Johnson wasn't there for the urgent question. But we did hear from the Prime Minister not long afterwards when he spoke just before the statement on the situation in Ukraine.
Yes. Now, there's no doubt that opposition MPs would have loved to have had Boris Johnson at the dispatch box answering the question. To be fair, though, Angela Rayner had asked the question of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Steve Barclay, and he's the head of the Cabinet Office, and he's obviously free to choose whichever minister he wants to put up to answer the question. We noticed before that Michael Ellis has been sent out on these questions before. He's a barrister, he's a former Solicitor General. He's obviously very experienced at handling a brief, and he has been the person who's been putting forward the defence. But Boris Johnson was there. He was just sort of waiting in the sidelights, if you like, because as soon as that urgent question was over, we got this statement on Ukraine. And so, as Michael Ellis cleared out, in comes Boris Johnson to deliver the statement on Ukraine. And before he gets to the nub of the issue, he decides to talk about that police investigation.
A few weeks ago, I commissioned an independent inquiry into a series of events in Downing Street and the Cabinet Office, as well as some other Whitehall departments that may have constituted potential breaches of the COVID regulations. That process has quite properly involved sharing information continuously with the Metropolitan Police, so I welcome the Met's decision to conduct its own investigation, because I believe this will help to give the public the clarity it needs and help to draw a line under matters.
And we're going to come back to the situation in Ukraine later on in the show. Sean, that was the Prime Minister's statement in response to the announcement of the police inquiry, and the debate over parties continued at PMQs.
That's right. So for the first few hours after that announcement, it was being suggested by some MPs that this was actually good news for the Prime Minister because it meant that there'd be a sort of pause while everybody waited for the police to continue their investigation, to finish their investigation. But it was quite clear that the arguments weren't going to stop and the issue wasn't going to go away. So we had another very noisy Prime Minister's questions. Last week, you'll remember, we had the drama of a defection at the beginning, and that contributed to an extremely noisy and rowdy session. This week, I think, was just as noisy. I was in the House of Commons, and the thing you don't always get when you're watching clips is just how noisy it is, because the sound is kind of balanced out so that we can hear what people are saying. But often the speaker, where he's sitting, can't hear very much because everybody is shouting from both sides. This week, again, we had lots of action from the speaker intervening to tell people off for shouting too much. And also, crucially, at one stage, a backbench Labour MP used the word liar. Now, you're not allowed under parliamentary rules to call another MP a liar. The argument is that all MPs are honourable members and they do not tell lies in the Commons. And what happened was a Labour MP sought to get round this by saying that his constituents thought that the Prime Minister was a liar, and the Speaker had to step in. And this is part of a trend we've seen during this argument, that there's been much more heated language in the last couple of weeks, and we've had a lot of interventions from the Speaker. But the main focus, of course, was the attack led by the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer.
On the 8th of December, the Prime Minister told this House, "I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged there was no party." So since he acknowledges the ministerial code applies to him, will he now resign?
No, Mr. Speaker. But, you know, since he asks about COVID restrictions, let me just remind the House, and indeed remind the country, that he has been relentlessly opportunistic throughout. He has flip-flopped from one side to the other.
Having got the material from Sue Gray, the police had to take a decision as to whether what they had before them was the most serious and flagrant types of breach of the rules. If members want to laugh at that, laugh. The police spelt out what they meant. They decided on the material they've already got that those involved knew or ought to have known what they were doing was an offence, and that there was little ambiguity around the absence of any reasonable defence.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the right honourable gentleman understands that although the issue that he raises is important, there is simply no way, as he knows, as a lawyer, that I can comment on the investigation that he is currently taking place.
He told this House, "I will place a copy of the report in the library of the House of Commons." His spokesperson has repeatedly stated that means the full report, not parts of the report, not a summary of the report, not an edited copy. So can the Prime Minister confirm that he will publish the full Sue Gray report as he receives it?
Of course, when I receive it, of course I will do exactly what I said, but I can tell him that in the meantime, I think what the people of this country want to hear is what we're doing to tackle the issues that matter to all of us, fixing the cost of living, Mr. Speaker, helping people across the country.
Whatever he says in his statement later today or tomorrow won't change the facts. Isn't this a Prime Minister and a government that have shown nothing but contempt for the decency, honesty and respect that define this country?
Prime Minister! The problem with the Labour Party today, Mr. Speaker, is that he's a lawyer, not a leader. That's the truth, Mr. Speaker. We've taken the tough decisions. We've got the big calls right, and in particular, I am getting on with the job.
Every moment he stays, he's dragging out the agony for families who are reminded of the sacrifices they made and dragging his party further through the dirt. The public knows it, the House knows it, even his own MPs know it. When will the Prime Minister cop on and go?
Precisely because I enjoy cooperating with him so much and with all his Scottish colleagues that I have absolutely no intention of doing what he suggests.
Sean, do we actually know when we might hear from Sue Gray and perhaps get sight of this report and what the procedure will be?
No, is the honest answer. I think in terms of the procedure, we know that the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, is very concerned that MPs should be the first to hear of big announcements, and he wants them to hear that in the Commons and not on the media. And so he has been very keen to make sure that MPs have enough time to go through whatever is released so they can ask sensible questions. What we know is that Downing Street have said that they will release the report once they've received it, and we expect that there will be some time given for MPs to look at it, and then the Prime Minister will come to the Commons and he will make a statement on the findings of the report and will then be subjected to questions. And that, of course, could be a really big parliamentary moment. I think you might see similar scenes to those at Prime Minister's questions, where it's literally standing room only and people are crowding in, and that could be quite a moment of tension and parliamentary drama.
Well, we're getting used to those, aren't we, Sean? We'll come back to you later on in the programme. Let's go to the Scottish Parliament and join our correspondent there, Jenny Davidson. Hello to you, Jenny. There were more changes to COVID restrictions this week, this time to the working from home guidelines, but it's not a move back to full office-based working, is it?
That's right. It's another sort of small incremental change here in Scotland, as we've seen over the past couple of weeks. And this time it's the introduction of hybrid working, so a partial return to offices but not a full return. Now, Nicola Sturgeon highlighted that we shouldn't expect a mass return from next week, and that any wholesale return at this stage was likely to set back progress, in her opinion, with COVID cases still quite high.
Now, we would not expect to see a wholesale return to the office next week. Indeed, given that the level of infection, though falling, remains high, a mass return at this stage is likely to be counterproductive and indeed to set progress back. But we know there are many benefits to both employees and employers and to the economy as a whole in at least a partial return to the office at this stage. Indeed, many businesses successfully implemented hybrid working last autumn, and so as part of a phased return to the office, we will again encourage employers to consider hybrid working and look to them to determine how best to manage this transition in consultation with workers and trade unions.
We trust people across Scotland to judge what's best for them and their families. Yet the First Minister's statement says that from the end of January, guidance on working from home will still advise against a wholesale return to the office. While some people will still want to work from home, why doesn't the First Minister leave that decision up to employers and the workers themselves? And what does she think this means for the businesses who rely on workers being back in the office and back in our communities, our city centres and our town centres.
So no change at the moment to the other two controversial areas of restriction, that's vaccine passports and face masks in schools. But the First Minister did say the Scottish Government would be publishing its strategic framework within the next few weeks. And with the emergency powers due to end on the 31st of March, attention has also turned to which of the powers that have been introduced during COVID might continue afterwards.
Jenny, on a completely different subject, there was also an announcement from the Scottish Government about plans for more charging points for electric vehicles. Tell us about that.
That's right, and it comes in the context of the publication of a wider transport strategy last week, and also acknowledgement that, particularly with Scotland being a very rural country, that cars will still have a role to play within future transport, even with taking account of climate change. Now, Transport Secretary Michael Matheson announced a new public electric vehicle infrastructure fund worth £60 million, and the aim is to double the existing network of public electric car chargers from the current number of 2,100 approximately. But opposition parties were questioning whether this doubling is going to be anywhere near enough, with Scotland needing an estimated 30,000 public chargers by 2030.
Electric vehicles have a key role to play, not least in helping us reach our target to cut emissions by 70% by 2030 and to zero by 2045. Moreover, we have already acknowledged that cars and vans will still be needed, particularly to get around in rural and island communities. By 2030, we might expect there to be between 500,000 and 1 million electric vehicles. And from then, it will not be possible to buy a new petrol or diesel car or van.
The Cabinet Secretary says today's announcement will mean over the next few years the size of Scotland's existing network of public charge points, which currently just over 2,000, he says, will double. Well, Presiding Officer, we do need to go further, and we need to go a lot faster than that. As we've heard, the Climate Change Committee implies that a Scottish total of around 30,000 will be needed by 2030. And Transport Scotland also say that a ratio of one public charge point for every 10 electric vehicles is sometimes quoted as a guide for provision. Now, based on the estimate given today by the Cabinet Secretary for the number of electric vehicles, that would mean anywhere between 50,000 and 100,000 public charging points by 2030. So does the Cabinet accept that today's announcement won't deliver either 30,000, never mind 50,000 of those public charging points?
The estimate is that there will be between 500,000 and 1 million electric vehicles by 2030, and also at that point it will be no longer possible to buy a new petrol or diesel car in Scotland. So obviously this question of how many charging points are going to be needed is quite a key one.
Now, social care was raised at First Minister's questions after a highly critical report was published this week. What did it say?
Yes, not the report that everyone was waiting for, but nevertheless a very significant report published by the Accounts Commission and the Auditor General for Scotland, so the auditors of public services here, very critical of the state of social care in Scotland, referring to significant problems, saying the need for improvements in social care are now urgent and that a lack of action now presents serious risks, and also that the pandemic's exacerbated challenges, particularly refers to problems around workforce, high numbers of vacancies, and saying that staff are not adequately valued, engaged or rewarded for their vital role, and that there's a gender-based issue in this, in that about 85% of these staff are female. Now, Nicola Sturgeon has, said that she is dealing with this. She's setting up a national care service. Also has promised to increase social care pay by 48p from £10.02 an hour to £10.50 an hour. But Labour's calling for much more. It wants to see an increase in pay from up to £12 an hour immediately, and then going up to £15 an hour after that.
The SNP have been in government for 15 years. There is no one else to blame. A social care sector neglected before the pandemic, failed during the pandemic. A workforce ignored, overstretched and undervalued. Those in need of care at home neglected and struggling to cope. Unpaid carers, disproportionately women, carrying the burden of this government's failures. We have been calling for a national care service for over a decade, but it can't now be used as a government slogan to delay action until 2026.
I can't allow this moment to pass without reminding Anna Sarwar that, yes, we have been in office in national government in this Parliament for 15 years. For much of that, in, for example, Glasgow City Council, Labour were in administration, denying female workers the equal pay to which they were entitled. And it took an SNP administration in that council to deliver equal pay to women workers across Glasgow. We will, of course, continue to increase the pay of adult social care workers. We have already taken the step I have spoken about. Just this month, in terms of unpaid carers, we've announced additional investment to help them with respite, for example, and we will take forward the plans to deliver that national care service, that reform that I hope future generations will look back on with as much significance as this generation looks back on the establishment of the National Health Service.
With the focus on social care in the wake of the pandemic and this sense of urgency, we can expect to see some more action and some more pressure on this soon.
Jenny, thank you very much. Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood. Let's catch up again with you, Sean. Find out what else has been happening, if there's been room for anything else here at Westminster. But of course, all this discussion about parties and events in Whitehall and Downing Street is running parallel to the unfolding situation on the border of Ukraine. And there was a statement from the Prime Minister about precisely that, the situation there. What did he have to say?
Yes, so Russia has been amassing troops on the border with Ukraine for some time. Russia insists it is not going to invade Ukraine, but we know that the US and other NATO countries are fearful that there will be some form of invasion and military action. So there is a lot of diplomatic activity going on at the moment. And we saw this week the United States sending arms and material to Ukraine. Now, as you say, that's been sort of crowded out a little bit at Westminster. And we heard at the beginning of the programme Sir Edward Lee with his complaint that perhaps people becoming distracted with parties. But the Prime Minister did come to the Commons, and his job really was to set out what the UK's position was on events in Ukraine at the moment.
Ukrainians have every moral and legal right to defend their country, and I believe their resistance would be dogged and tenacious, and the bloodshed comparable to the First War in Chechnya or Bosnia. We've sought to combine dialogue with deterrence, emphasising how a united Western alliance would exact a forbidding price for any Russian incursion into Ukraine, including by imposing heavy economic sanctions.
For too long, the implicit message to Moscow has been that President Putin can do what he likes and the West will do little to respond. We must now change course and show Russia that any further aggression will result in severe real-world consequences. For Britain and our allies, that will mean taking tough decisions. That won't be easy.
It is not too late to mobilise a sizable NATO presence in Ukraine, utilising the superior hard power the alliance possesses to make Putin think twice about invading another European democracy.
Will the Prime Minister convene a summit of G7 energy ministers, as we had back in 2014, to look at how we can improve short-term and medium-term energy security, protect consumers in this country and elsewhere against rocketing gas prices, and give ourselves a much stronger hand in the face of Putin's aggression?
Much of the work that he did on renewables when he was in office was prescient and valuable for this country, and it's put us in a stronger position to resist the Russian gas blackmail. As I told the House just now, of our gas supplies, only 3% comes from Russia.
That focus on Ukraine will obviously continue. But in a week of debate, Sean, about integrity in politics, it was timely then that the Commons Committee on Standards held 2 days of hearings. What are they actually about?
Yeah, well, the Committee on Standards is made up of MPs and some lay members. And they're the people who oversee the work of the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner. And that's the person that people complain to when they've got a complaint about an MP. And they have been looking at whether or not it's time to update the Code of Conduct for members of the Commons. The last review was in 2015, and the committee has been working on this since 2020. And it actually did publish a report just before Christmas with some proposals to tighten up the rules on lobbying and indeed on other proposals as well on MPs' behaviour. But this was a sort of an extra session. As you say, over 2 days, they took a range of opinions. They heard from experts, they heard from some journalists, and they heard from the Parliamentary Commissioner themselves. And it was a pretty lively couple of days.
The lesson that I would take from the last 6 months is that if ministers and others in public life are careful and think ahead around the potential implications of not maintaining very carefully high public standards, then there can be a political price to pay.
I would say the same thing is, what do you think these companies are paying the money for? You think they're chucking it away? I mean, and when politicians declare their interests, I mean, why do they think these businesses are paying them this money? Why did Aaron Patterson think he was being given all this money? What, because he's so brilliant?
You can police rules tougher and you have tougher rules, but lots of people will carry on gaming rules. If they think the rules are the only issue and they don't understand why the rules exist, what the principles are behind the rules, you're not going to change people's attitudes.
Well, that's just depressing, the idea that politicians are so innately corrupt that they won't understand public anger at what they're doing, and none of them will obey the rules.
Members of the public are really angry. They're really angry about the ways in which they see members of Parliament exploiting opportunities to make additional money. There is no prohibition on that, but members of the public are very angry about that. They're very angry about what they see as conflicts of interest, that members of Parliament, or their perception of conflicts of interest.
Well, it was lively, as you said, Sean. Do we know when the committee hopes to report?
Well, as I say, they published one report before Christmas, and that contained some proposals about MPs' behaviour. They said MPs should refrain from excessive attacks online, and they wanted that in the rules. And they did also want to tighten up the rules on MPs giving advice to outside bodies. Basically, they wanted to stop that. There is going to be a debate in the Commons next week on those proposals, but they're still out for consultation. And this is the beginning of a process that will end with the committee coming up with a draft code of conduct that in the end the Commons will be asked to approve and put into place.
Thank you for now, Sean. It's time to go to the Welsh Parliament, to the Senedd, talk to our reporter there, Cemlyn Davies, who can tell us what's been going on this week, particularly debating the impact of COVID on education in Wales. What was said, Cemlyn?
Yes, Joe. On Tuesday, the Education Minister, Jeremy Miles, announced his plan for schools now as restrictions are eased across Wales. And he said that face coverings would still be required in the classroom until after the half-term holidays next month. Now, that's something, of course, that's already changed in England. And that was a point that came up when this was all debated here on Wednesday.
Masks in a classroom stop children and young people in Wales enjoying a normal experience in the classroom. It continues to stifle their development. Their mental health of children has suffered enough.
James, will you take an intervention from Jenny Rathbone?
Yeah, 2 seconds. Children in Wales deserve to live in an open and inclusive environment. I will take an intervention from Jenny Rathbone, yes.
Thank you, James. Did you not hear me when I said earlier we need face masks in order to prevent COVID spreading in the classroom, both to fellow pupils and also to protect staff? Otherwise, we'll have the situation we've got in parts of England where there's just swathes and swathes of children and staff off with COVID.
Well, I'd like to thank Jenny for her intervention. However, we do need to start to learn to live with COVID. We don't put masks on in school for any other type of infection or disease which comes forward. So I don't think that is needed at the moment. And I echo the words of the Shadow Minister for Education, Laura Jones, who has been vocal against the decision by this Labour government to make school children to continue to wear face masks until March.
Advocating the approach of the government for England in relation to face coverings seems especially reckless on a day when COVID-related absence in England's schools is at its highest point since the start of the academic year. We want pupils to be in schools, and our focus has been on ensuring that schools, education, colleges and education settings are safe places to learn.
The Education Minister there, and he has also said that a final decision on what schools will be expected to do next will be taken in a couple of weeks' time.
And there was also a debate this week on the UK government's elections bill.
Yes, and one of the key points of that bill is that voters would be required to show ID in order to take part in certain UK elections. Now, this wouldn't apply to Senedd elections because they're devolved, of course, but Plaid Cymru and Labour are concerned that it could lead to confusion having two different sets of rules for different elections, particularly if you've got two or more elections happening on the same day. So, for example, last year the Police and Crime Commissioner elections coincided with the Senedd vote. And what's Plaid Cymru in particular concerned is that this could discourage people from turning out.
Why would we want to limit people and dissuade them from sharing their voices and their opinions with us? Anyone who supports this bill, and I'm looking at my friends who usually sit opposite me in the chamber, should never again criticise this Senedd or any other election, for that matter, for low turnout, if they are supporting through this the voter ID that will actively turn people away and discourage voters.
It's pretty astonishing that both Labour and Plaid persist in their opposition to voter ID when in recent months you've been requiring people to verify their identity in order to access a COVID pass to watch a film at their local cinema. Now, if you're happy to impose ID requirements to watch the latest Spider-Man movie, why do you have a problem with people being required to show their ID in order to vote?
Boris Johnson and his government are hell-bent on ducking and diving from accountability at every turn, hardly surprising given their recent exploits. So it comes as no surprise that there is a desire from the Conservatives to entrench themselves within a system that breeds the entitlement and self-serving behaviour we have seen over the past few weeks. This is a shameful and disproportionate measure to undermine democracy by the Conservatives.
So a lively debate there, Joe, with the Conservatives on the one hand insisting that this is all about strengthening democracy and preventing voter fraud, and then the other parties arguing, well, no, it's about undermining democracy and making it more difficult for people to vote.
Now, on a lighter note, there were celebrations across Wales this week as Wales's largest youth organisation celebrated its 100th birthday, and that was marked by members of the Senedd too. What did it involve?
Yes, that's right. The Urdd was set up in 1922 to give children and young people across Wales an opportunity to do things through the medium of Welsh. And on Tuesday, several MSs here shared their memories of taking part in Urdd events when they were younger. And the Llywydd, the Senedd's presiding officer, even sang part of the Urdd's anthem.
If we, as a Senedd, weren't meeting virtually today, I would have wanted all members to have stood and to sing. But as we are meeting virtually and having embarrassed myself completely there, we will wish the Urdd well for the next century and thank them for everything that they've achieved for our young people.
Ellen Jones there, and the Senedd building here in Cardiff Bay was lit up in the Earth's colours on Tuesday night to mark the occasion as well.
Oh, well, it all sounds lovely. Thank you very much, Kemlyn. Let's go to Northern Ireland and catch up with our reporter there, Jim Fitzpatrick. He's outside the Parliament buildings at Stormont. Jim, the Ulster Unionist leader, Doug Beattie, was fighting for his political survival this week. What's been happening?
Yes, this is Doug Beattie, who is a former army captain, decorated for his actions in Afghanistan, where he was awarded the Military Cross, recognised by people such as Baroness Ruth Davidson as one of the most interesting people in politics at the moment. She said he was probably the man who could save the Union, that he had a wicked sense of humour and that he passed the pub test on popularity. And indeed, his popularity has been credited with helping his party. They've enjoyed a resurgence in the polls. It's been called the Beattie Bounce, and it's been related by some to his more outward-looking vision of unionism, what he calls his union of people. But it was the social media test that he failed last weekend when, on Saturday, he was ambushed by one of his own tweets. It was an off-colour joke about himself and the DUP minister, Edmund Poots, which also involved Edmund Poots' wife. By Sunday, there was a Twitter storm and Mr Beattie had apologised for the joke and deleted the tweet. But by Monday, a trawl of his tweets by various people had unearthed tweets going back about 10 years that were crude, sexist and even racist. And so then he was indeed fighting for his political life. He endured a number of lengthy and really excruciating media interviews where he apologised for these tweets. He said they didn't reflect his sentiments or how he felt today. And then he offered his apology to MLAs in the chamber.
We must all be mindful of our language, and I've said so on the floor of this chamber on many occasions. We must guard against language that is both hurtful and harmful. Over the weekend, I let my guard down, and for that I am truly sorry. I posted a joke, and regardless of what my intentions were, it wasn't just inappropriate, it was absolutely wrong and fundamentally wrong. And therefore it's important that I stand here and I say to Mr and Mrs Poots that I am sorry for the hurt that I may have caused. But I have to say to wider society, Mr Speaker, that my language was wrong at every level, and I have to apologise to all of them. We have to guard against this, and I did not. I did not show the leadership that I should have shown, but I can, by standing here, just say to people that it was, although a mistake, it was wrong.
For those in political leadership that engage in that everyday sexism and think it's a joke, that's just disgusting in itself. That's not political leadership. Political leadership is calling out things whenever it's wrong, and in this case, misogyny online is a huge problem. And in the period that we've just come through, in the aftermath of the death of Ashley Murphy, and the sort of outpouring of grief, but even more than that, the anger, the fact that this still exists in such a systemic way, for a political leader to be engaged in online what he deems to be jokes, I do not deem to be jokes, I think it's just incredulous.
Now, Doug Beattie has survived as party leader, but the DUP minister is taking legal action.
Jim, as negotiations over the Northern Ireland Protocol between the UK Government and the EU Commission continue, the costs and benefits remain a matter of some contention at Stormont.
Yes, of course, this is the protocol which keeps Northern Ireland within the EU single market for goods, thereby avoiding a hard border in Ireland. But in so doing, it creates barriers in trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland and creates, to some extent, a sea border, the Irish sea border. And of course, it's a very emotive issue because for unionists, the idea of an internal border within the UK is something they really don't like. And for nationalists, the idea of a border in Ireland is something that they don't like. And the economic debate is coloured by these political allegiances. So things kicked off in the Assembly this week when the DUP Economy Minister, Gordon Lyons, referenced the costs of the protocol as estimated by one economist.
In respect of costs, Dr Esmond Burney, an economist appointed to the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council by Finance Minister Conor Murphy after agreement of the Executive, reports that frictions on our trade with GB could cost the Northern Ireland economy in the region of £900 million. Other published studies consistently point to the profound economic consequences of disrupting trade with GB. It is clear that tinkering around the edges will not cut it. We need action from the government now, and permanent and complete solutions that remove these frictions in GB to NI trade.
The Minister and his colleagues are fond of cherry-picking figures. I see he's not quoting the bit in the same study about how substituting imports from the EU and the rest of the world, because we can, under the protocol, could reduce the impact on GDP by half.
You named Esmond Burney and his claims around the cost of the protocol. I have a letter from the Fiscal Council which makes clear that it's not from that organisation. I note Dr Burney has failed to publish his claims in any reputable peer-reviewed journal, so you should be aware of that before you start banding it about on the floor of the Assembly. Can I draw your attention, Mr Deputy Speaker? Can I draw your attention, Mr. Can I draw your attention,
have a
Minister,
question,
to some
please?
Specific statistics. 60% rise in increase in exports from Northern Ireland to the EU single market and the Republic. Two-thirds of Northern Ireland Chamber members see the protocol as an opportunity. 80% of manufacturing and
Order. Would the member take a seat?
Now, Matthew O'Toole clarified that he wasn't criticising Esmond Burney, just stating the fact that he had been doing his figures as an individual, not as part of the Fiscal Council. Mr O'Toole previously worked at the Treasury, takes interest in these matters, and he's right to point out that many in the business community do see the benefits of remaining in the single market, although they do want those barriers on trade within the UK to be minimised.
Right, Jim. Well, that was a lively session there. Jim Fitzpatrick, thank you at Stormont. Let's talk to Sean Curran again here and look at one more story from Westminster. As if there hadn't been enough drama, there was also a resignation this week, unexpectedly, I thought, from the government benches in the House of Lords. And it certainly provided a dramatic moment at the dispatch box. What happened?
This was a big surprise. A minister, Lord Agnew, who was the efficiency minister working in the Treasury and the Cabinet Office, was expected to come to the House of Lords and defend the government's record on dealing with fraud in some of the COVID schemes that were set up to help business at the start of the pandemic. It was thought to be a fairly routine affair, and it turned out to be anything but.
My Lords, you can see is my deeply held conviction that the current state of affairs is not acceptable. Given that I'm the Minister for Counter Fraud, it feels somewhat dishonest to stay on in that role if I'm incapable of doing it properly, let alone defending our track record. It is for this reason that I've sadly decided to tender my resignation as a Minister across the Treasury and Cabinet Office with immediate effect. I would be grateful if my noble Lord would pass this letter on to the Prime Minister at his earliest convenience. It is worth saying that none of this relates to far more dramatic political events being played out across Westminster. This is not an attack on the Prime Minister, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience it will cause. I hope that as a virtually unknown minister beyond this place, giving up my career might prompt others more important than me to get behind this and sort it out. So it leaves me only to thank the noble Lord Tunnicliffe for his courteous but attentive role as my shadow minister of my portfolio, and to thank noble friends, many of whom I know will carry on their scrutiny of this important area. Thank you and goodbye.
My Lords, I think we've just witnessed one of the most dramatic moments we've ever seen in your Lordship's House of a minister who felt his integrity could no longer ensure he remained a member of the government.
Well, Baroness Smith certainly right on that point. On the subject, during Prime Minister's questions, Boris Johnson was asked by the Labour MP, Kate Osamore, whether he agreed to the Chancellor writing off £4.3 billion worth of fraud.
Yes, and Boris Johnson very dramatically said no, and then he went on to say, well, of course, we don't agree to letting fraudsters get away with money. And that raised the question, well, was he dropping the Chancellor in it? And later on, Rishi Sunak tweeted to say that he was committed to getting the money back. But there's certainly been a big discussion about how much has actually been lost to fraud, and there's been these questions about how the government might get it back. Rishi Sunak was very clear in his tweet to say that they were working very hard to get the money back and they were committed to recovering as much money as they possibly could.
I normally ask you what's going to happen next week, but on this occasion, I don't think I will, because it's impossible to predict. That's all for our roundup of politics across the UK this week. I'm back on Monday with Politics Live. Until then, have a very good weekend. Bye-bye.